How the Other Half Lives. Studies Among the Tenements of New York. Chapter 1. Genesis of the Tenement. By Jacob A. Riis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. The first tenement New York knew bore the mark of Cain from its birth, though a generation passed before the writing was deciphered. It was the Riis house, infamous ever after in our city's history. There had been tenant houses before, but they were not built for the purpose. Nothing would probably have shocked their original owners more than the idea of their harboring a promiscuous crowd, for they were the decorous homes of the old Knickerbockers, the proud aristocracy of Manhattan in the early days. It was the stir and bustle of trade, together with the tremendous immigration that followed upon the War of 1812, that dislodged them. In 35 years, the city of less than 100,000 came to harbor 500,000 souls, for whom homes had to be found. Within the memory of men not yet in their prime, Washington had moved from his house on Cherry Hill, as too far out of town to be easily reached. Now the old residents followed his example, but they moved in a different direction and for a different reason. Their comfortable dwellings in the once fashionable streets along the East River front fell into the hands of real estate agents and boarding-house keepers. And here, says the report to the legislature of 1857, when the evils engendered had excited just alarm, in its beginning the tenant house became a real blessing to that class of industrious poor whose small earnings limited their expenses, and whose employment in workshops, stores, or about the warehouses and thoroughfares render a near residence of much importance. Not for long, however. As business increased and the city grew with rapid strides, the necessities of the poor became the opportunity of their wealthier neighbors, and the stamp was set upon the old houses, suddenly become valuable, which the best thought and effort of a later age has vainly struggled to efface. Their large rooms were partitioned into several smaller ones, without regard to light or ventilation, the rate of rent being lower in proportion to space or height from the street, and they soon became filled from cellar to garret with a class of tenantry living from hand to mouth, loose in morals, improvident in habits, degraded and squalid as beggary itself. It was thus the dark bedroom, prolific of untold depravities, came into the world. It was destined to survive the old houses. In their new role, says the old report, eloquent in its indignant denunciation of evils more destructive than wars, they were not intended to last. Rents were fixed high enough to cover damage and abuse from this class, from whom nothing was expected, and the most was made of them while they lasted. Neatness, order, cleanliness were never dreamed of in connection with the tenant house system, as it spread its localities from year to year, while reckless slovenliness, discontent, privation, and ignorance were left to work out their invariable results, until the entire premises reached the level of tenant house dilapidation, containing, but sheltering not, the miserable hordes that crowded beneath smoldering, water-rotted roofs, or burrowed among the rats of clammy cellars. Yet so illogical is human greed that, at a later day, when called to account, the proprietors frequently urged the filthy habits of the tenants as an excuse for the condition of their property, utterly losing sight of the fact that it was the tolerance of those habits which was the real evil, and that for this they themselves were alone responsible. Still, the pressure of the crowds did not abate, and in the old garden where the stolid Dutch burgher grew his tulips or early cabbages, a rear house was built, generally of wood, 2 stories high at first. Presently it was carried up another story and another. Where 2 families had lived, 10 moved in. The front house followed suit, if the brick walls were strong enough. The question was not always asked, judging from complaints made by a contemporary witness that the old buildings were often carried up to a great height without regard to the strength of the foundation walls. It was rent the owner was after. Nothing was said in the contract about either the safety or the comfort of the tenants. The garden gate no longer swung on its rusty hinges. The shell-paved walk had become an alley. What the rear house had left of the garden, a court. Plenty such are yet to be found in the Fourth Ward, with here and there one of the original rear tenements. Worse was to follow. It was soon perceived by estate owners and agents of property that a greater percentage of profits could be realized by the conversion of houses and blocks into barracks, and dividing their space into smaller proportions capable of containing human life within four walls. Blocks were rented of real estate owners, or purchased on time, or taken in charge at a percentage, and held for underletting. With the appearance of the middleman, wholly irresponsible and utterly reckless and unrestrained, began the era of tenement building, which turned out such blocks as Gotham Court, where, in one cholera epidemic that scarcely touched the clean boards, the tenants died at the rate of 195 to the 1,000 of population, which forced the general mortality of the city up from 1 in 41.83 in 1815 to 1 in 27.33 in 1855, a year of unusual freedom from epidemic disease, and which wrung from the early organizers of the health department this wail: there are numerous examples of tenement houses in which are lodged several hundred people that have a pro rata allotment of ground area scarcely equal to 2 square yards upon the city lot, courtyards and all included. The tenement house population had swelled to 500,000 souls by that time, and on the east side, in what is still the most densely populated district in all the world, China not excluded, it was packed at the rate of 290,000 to the square mile, a state of affairs wholly unexampled. The utmost cupidity of other lands and other days had never contrived to herd much more than half that number within the same space. The greatest crowding of old London was at the rate of 175,816. Swine roamed the streets and gutters as their principal scavengers. The death of a child in a tenement was registered at the Bureau of Vital Statistics as plainly due to suffocation in the foul air of an unventilated apartment, and the senators, who had come down from Albany to find out what was the matter with New York, reported that there are annually cut off from the population by disease and death enough human beings to people a city, and enough human labor to sustain it. And yet experts had testified that, as compared with uptown, rents were from 25 to 30% higher in the worst slums of the lower wards, with such accommodations as were enjoyed, for instance, by a family with boarders in Cedar Street, who fed hogs in the cellar that contained 8 or 10 loads of manure, or one room 12 by 12 with 5 families living in it, comprising 20 persons of both sexes and all ages, with only 2 beds, without partition, screen, chair, or table. The rate of rent has been successfully maintained to the present day, though the hog, at least, has been eliminated. Lest anybody flatter himself with the notion that these were evils of a day that is happily past, and may safely be forgotten, let me mention here 3 very recent instances of tenement house life that came under my notice. One was the burning of a rear house in Mott Street, from appearances one of the original tenant houses that made their owners rich. The fire made homeless 10 families, who had paid an average of $5 a month for their mean little cubby holes. The owner himself told me that it was fully insured for $800, though it brought him in $600 a year rent. He evidently considered himself especially entitled to be pitied for losing such valuable property. Another was the case of a hard-working family of man and wife, young people from the old country, who took poison together in a Crosby Street tenement because they were tired. There was no other explanation, and none was needed when I stood in the room in which they had lived. It was in the attic, with sloping ceiling and a single window so far out on the roof that it seemed not to belong to the place at all. With scarcely room enough to turn around in, they had been compelled to pay $5.50 a month in advance. There were 4 such rooms in that attic, and together they brought in as much as many a handsome little cottage in a pleasant part of Brooklyn. The third instance was that of a colored family of husband, wife, and baby in a wretched rear rookery in West 3rd Street. Their rent was $8.50 for a single room on the top story, so small that I was unable to get a photograph of it, even by placing the camera outside the open door. 3 short steps across either way would have measured its full extent. There was just one excuse for the early tenement house builders, and their successors may plead it with nearly as good right for what it is worth. Such, says an official report, is the lack of house room in the city that any kind of tenement can be immediately crowded with lodgers if there is space offered. Thousands were living in cellars. There were 300 underground lodging houses in the city when the health department was organized. Some 15 years before that, the old Baptist church in Mulberry Street, just off Chatham Street, had been sold, and the rear half of the frame structure had been converted into tenements. That with their swarming population became the scandal even of that reckless age. The wretched pile harbored no less than 40 families, and the annual rate of deaths to the population was officially stated to be 75 in 1,000. These tenements were an extreme type of very many, for the big barracks had by this time spread east and west, and far up the island into the sparsely settled wards. Whether or not the title was clear to the land upon which they were built was of less account than that the rents were collected. If there were damages to pay, the tenant had to foot them. Cases were very frequent when property was in litigation, and 2 or 3 different parties were collecting rents. Of course, under such circumstances, no repairs were ever made. The climax had been reached. The situation was summed up by the Society for the Improvement of the Condition of the Poor in these words: crazy old buildings, crowded rear tenements in filthy yards, dark, damp basements, leaking garrets, shops, outhouses, and stables converted into dwellings, though scarcely fit to shelter brutes, are habitations of thousands of our fellow beings in this wealthy Christian city. The city, says its historian Mrs. Martha Lamb, commenting on the era of aqueduct building between 1835 and 1845, was a general asylum for vagrants. Young vagabonds, the natural offspring of such home conditions, overran the streets. Juvenile crime increased fearfully year by year. The Children's Aid Society and kindred philanthropic organizations were yet unborn. But in the city directory was to be found the address of the American Society for the Promotion of Education in Africa. End of How the Other Half Lives. Studies Among the Tenements of New York. Chapter 1. Genesis of the Tenement. By Jacob A. Riis.